Welcome to the Mama Needs a Moment podcast with your hosts, Chrissy and Cindy, co-founders of Her Plus Health Collective, and moms who understand the chaos of juggling it all. But here's the thing, your well-being matters. That's why we're on a mission to change the way moms take care of themselves. This season, every episode features a roundtable conversation, bringing together trusted experts from different backgrounds to talk about the topics that matter most to moms, creating space for more collaborative whole person care. These episodes are short, meaningful, and easy to fit into real life. You'll hear from our Her Plus expert providers sharing expert insight and real life tips you can use right away. Learn more about them in our free provider directory linked in the show notes. So take a deep breath, grab your coffee, and let's make these moments count. Welcome back to Mama Needs a Moment, and we'd like to offer a very warm welcome to our Her Plus expert providers who are joining us for today's discussion. It's great to see all of you, and we appreciate you being here. And we're going to be discussing the topic of co-parenting and blended families. Before we begin, each expert will briefly introduce themselves and share their area of focus. Our podcast episodes are also available in video format on our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and get started with introductions. I'm looking straight at LaToya. So LaToya, could you hop on and just let everybody hear your voice and what you do?
Yes, thanks so much. I'm LaToya Toller. I'm a mental health therapist. My business is Mindful Counseling Professionals. I work with anxiety, grief, parenting, relationship issues, and I'm also a wellness-centered interior decorator, and my business there is Mindful Home Interiors.
Perfect. You'll have so many insights. Thanks for being here. Marianne.
Hey, thanks for having me. So I'm Marianne Brenneman. I'm the owner of Mindful Health and Harmony, and I am a board certified teen and family coach. And I work with families to become more communicative with each other, more centered, more connected, more confident in their relationships.
Excellent. You'll have some great insights. Anastasia.
Of course. Hi, my name's Anastasia Aruz, and I am a licensed counselor and a certified coach. And what I like to do is combine both the counseling and the coaching to help parents build emotionally healthy family systems. I specialize in helping parents navigate all kinds of family dynamics while protecting their own well-being and their child's safety.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So glad to have you here. And Irene.
I'm Irene Googe with Loving Lesson Sleep Solutions, and I help anxious, overwhelmed parents with preschoolers go from exhausted and confident. We pinpoint the root causes of sleep struggles, and we create a personalized plan with respectful sleep strategies.
Thank you so much, Irene. We're excited to have you all here and to hear all of your wonderful insights on this topic. Thank you so much.
I would love to start us off on a conversation around transitions because let's face it, transitions are one of the hardest things in raising children. Transitions are even hard for me sometimes. And I know that when we bring this dynamic of blended families and co-parenting, and it can become very complicated. It's one of the hardest parts of co-parenting and the blended family life for a lot of families. When kids are moving between homes, routines, caregivers, what actually helps them feel grounded and secure, especially when things can't look exactly the same in both households. So I'd love to direct this first question to LaToya. LaToya, you talk a lot about planning for emotional and physical transitions. What does that look like in real life for families, especially when kids are moving back and forth between homes and emotions are typically running pretty high?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Chrissy. Thank you. So one of the things that we all really need to function well is a sense of safety, and transitions such as divorce, remarriage, blended families happen fairly often. In the US, the divorce rate is about 43% for first-time marriages and then 60 to 73% for second and third marriages. And separations from the family home are usually difficult, even in the best of, circumstances. So again, even if the separations are amicable, they do represent some kind of loss for each member of the family, whether that's emotional, that's physical, that's financial. And that impact can be especially significant for kids. So according to the census for 2023, about 5.8% of kids lived with their moms alone. And then about 1.6% lived with their dads. And so that gives us information that there are a lot of kids who are kids of divorced parents and blended families that are moving back and forth between households on a pretty regular basis. Our kids are pretty vulnerable because they have little to no control over the decision making of their parents. They're dependent on us to create that sense of safety for them. So, kind of potentially moving back and forth once or twice a week between homes can be pretty stressful. And even though it can also provide that benefit of allowing the kids to see both their parents. And stress can cause breakdowns, for all of us in communication. It can increase confusion, conflict, can create declines in terms of well-being, physical health. So there are some helpful strategies that can, decrease the frequency of this and also support some stability. So one of the big things I would say is planning and communication by parents in advance of the transition. And that's helpful across the board in terms of just creating a workable plan as best as possible that they do share with their children in an age-appropriate way that's supportive as well. I think it's a good idea that kids are reassured about the transition, that it's an adult decision. It's not their fault. It's not due to anything that they've done. Kids have the tendency potentially to internalize their feelings, especially when they don't have fully the language to express, what it is they want to say. And most often kids really love both their parents. So having to feel like, oh, is this something caused by something that I did? We never want our kids to feel that way. Ideally, it's also important that kids are not put in a position where they feel they have to choose between parents, because that can also create feelings of guilt or betrayal or shame. And that, is really difficult for kids to manage those kinds of feelings. I would say as well that it would be important for our kids to have a sense of what to expect with new norms, those norms being shared with them before, again, the transitions occur, such as, where am I going to live? Are we going to stay in the same home? Are we going to stay in the same neighborhood? Will I still see my friends? Am I going to, have a specific change to my routines, roles, responsibilities of mom and dad? What are those going to look like, once the change happens? And, who's going to pick me up from the bus stop? Who's going to come to parent-teacher conferences, So what is the schedule for when I'm at dad's or when I'm at mom's, or, what that might look like? So communicating those kinds of changes and also letting those important people in the child's life know, like their teachers know that, okay, we're separating, and, please let me know if you observe any changes in terms of behavior or emotions. Some of those things are very typical, in terms of a transition that could occur. So we might see things like sadness or irritability, potentially even aggression at times in a relationship to a change that could happen. So these are just some things to consider in terms of kids having information that they can rely on, that can support their sense of safety, and then parents having a plan in place that addresses co-parenting, making decisions together as much as possible that create as much stability for their children. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is oftentimes even having a documented plan that can support the sense of accountability between both parents.
I love that you gave updated statistics. I've heard so many different numbers over the years, and it was really nice to just have those numbers front and center on what's happening in our current society. So thank you for sharing that. And you offered a lot of helpful things to keep in mind. One of the things that kept running through my mind is the differences for when it becomes a co-parenting relationship depending on the age of the children and how that affects situations. And something that you did say was having a plan even written out. So I'm sure that that can be helpful regardless of the age of your children.
Absolutely. And I think with the statistics, it really just encourages us to think about, like, this is a common occurrence. A lot of people might feel really isolated by going through this experience, but it's common, and having some helpful tools for us to work through, often go a long way.
Mm. Thank you so much for that. And something you had talked about was routines. And I want to ask Irene about something. I've heard you say, Irene, that actually flexible routines can create stability into homes. And I'm really curious on what you mean by that. So, can you share how I think you call them anchor routines help kids regulate and communicate their needs, even when household rules or environments differ?
Yeah. So I think a lot of times, going back to what Latoya was saying, was having a plan, having something written can oftentimes be helpful. And so when we think about a routine, it is the what do we do at the beginning, the middle, and the end of this process. And those anchor routines are really helpful around feeding and sleeping, which is what helps regulate us, helps us know, like, what part of the day are we in? What do I need to do to take care of my body? So I'm fueling myself and also resting. And so thinking about being between two homes, oftentimes I'll say, in the Gooch house, this is what it looks like to go to sleep, or this is what it looks like to eat. So what I'm doing when I say that language is I'm setting up the expectations of this is what it looks like in this house. And so what's important for parents to think about is, like, it's okay if they are not the exact same routines, but it's important to have maybe similar timing for children, to be respectful of their bodies. So we're creating some structure, yet there is freedom and flexibility for families to do and show up as who they are, as mom and dad, or whatever that situation looks like. And so I think that's where the anchor routines can be really helpful, where our children have, like, maybe a visual chart of, like, this is what bedtime looks like, and what Latoya was sharing was, like, sometimes sharing the schedule of, like, hey, this is what feeding looks like for our children Monday through Sunday, because sometimes we think, like, we'll just throw kiddos into the mix of things and they don't realize, like, maybe they're feeling dysregulated because they could be hungry and things are off, or maybe they're not getting the right amount of sleep. But, like, the going to sleep process could look different for both mom and dad. So, just thinking about those pieces that really help us regulate and feel our best, and creating that consistency in the home that way.
That's so powerful, Irene. I think about myself in this scenario, and I usually eat dinner like 4:30. So
Yeah.
when someone forces me to eat dinner at like 7 p.m., I'm not at my best. And when we have that situation with our children, and if they're jumping from, you talked about your bedtime and sleep routine and food, and those are two, even as adults, we struggle if our routine is different. And all the experts say, go to bed at the same time, and obviously that might not be the same from house to house, but if there can be communication, which is a theme I'm hearing come up again and again, if there can be communication and we can have some sort of pattern that repeats, I can see around those particular being very important. Marianne, I'm interested to know from your perspective, how important is consistency around things like bedtime, screen time? Thinking about that, especially for our older kids, I mean, younger too, but it becomes more of a battle with our older kids. Nutrition, visitation. Where does flexibility need to come in so families don't feel like they're constantly at odds with each other?
Right. I think you hit the big things, the four big things: the bedtime, the screen time, the nutrition, and the visitation. I hear about all of those things from the families that I work with. I definitely hear the biggest complaint is that the rules are different at each other's houses, or at the different houses. And I hear that from both the parents and the kids. Like, the kids are usually happier where it's more lenient, just because kids want what they want. And when I hear it from parents, they're just convinced that they're doing it right and the other co-parent is doing it wrong. So, as Latoya mentioned, we don't want those kids to feel guilty about wanting to spend more time with, at one house over the other. I hear that a lot. So I'm going to touch on each one of these things you talked about. So Irene is the expert on sleep here, of course, but I think bedtimes should be pretty consistent, but I think they have to be flexible if there's a special occasion, if it's a weekend, if there's a sleepover, if there's a party. Like, I have one parent who is insistent that the child still goes to bed at 8:30 on a Saturday night, even if there's a sleepover, and the kid's miserable because of that. I think a little bit of flexibility goes a long way. I still encourage them to try to get between 8 and 9 hours of sleep every night. Irene might say 8 to 10 hours of sleep, I guess is probably more like it. The screen time, We all know that unlimited, unregulated screen time is not good for anybody, much less a developing brain. Everything I'm going to say here, I should have prefaced all of this by saying this all requires a bit of communication among these parents. And I know that some divorced families are not able to have that type of communication. So in a perfect world, if there could be civil discourse between the two uncoupled people, I think that would be fantastic. But for the sake of the kids' brains, I think definitely deciding on screen time and what apps are allowable and what apps are not is super important to do. Nutrition is one I hear a lot about. I'm also a certified health coach. I don't practice that way, but I have that knowledge. And nutrition is tricky for people who are still married in an intact family. Not everybody likes the same thing. Not everybody wants to cook, whatever. What I did recently with a blended family is I had them come up with a list of the foods that they were definitely comfortable with in each house. Like in each house, we can have this. And in my house, I don't want them to have this. And they compared their list and they were able to come to some agreement about, okay, I won't serve this type of incredibly processed junk food in our house if you won't. Like, you just have to kind of negotiate that down. The biggest argument I see about dinner, though, is one parent inevitably cooks and the other one doesn't, right? So at one house, they're going to Chick-fil-A, they're going to Bojangles, they're going wherever they're going, and maybe you want to, again, have some kind of an agreement about how often are we going to eat out? What are we going to feed them? What are we going to do with that? The last one is visitation. And this is such a tough one. And I'm dealing with that with a couple of clients right now. Flexibility is super important with that. Recently, I had a client who had a death in the family out of state, and the co-parent would not allow the children to go to the funeral because it was his weekend. And that was really hard on everybody. And I get it that he wants to spend time with his kids, but his kids will never forget that he didn't allow them to go have this moment. So I think you have to be flexible. If it's your weekend and the kid has a sleepover and she really wants to go, let her go. It's one of those things. The kids did not ask for this situation. And I think it's kind of on the adults to do their level best to make sure that the children are getting what they need, obviously barring any dangerous behavior out of the other co-parent.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And I'm really glad that you brought up the relationship between the parents. I had made a note to address whether if there's hostility between the parents, how does that affect creating stability? And perhaps if any of you want to jump in and answer that, if you have any further insight on whether there is hostility between the caretakers and how to work through that particular situation.
Sometimes can be helpful to involve a mediator, just as kind of a person to really have a neutral approach and can hear both sides and can help if it doesn't feel like, together we can come to a point where we can make decisions together that best benefit our kids. So that can often be, a helpful exercise if it just feels like, we can't do this independently.
And Latoya, that's what I was going to say too. A mediator makes a huge difference. Just, in one case, in the last couple of years, I got the couple together, that ex-couple together, and I just said, this is what I'm hearing from your child, and this is what I'm hearing she needs, and what kind of an arrangement or agreement can we come to putting your child first? And they don't mean to, they're just at each other. They don't mean to do what they're doing to the kids. They're hurt. They're hurt and they're angry. And I think a mediator is a great way to just remind them that the children's well-being has to come first.
Yeah,
sure. Well, that's also an important topic to head into our second question, which is on the topic of communication, power struggles, and conflict resolution. And as we were just saying, not every co-parenting situation is going to be in harmony. There is going to be hostility between some of these situations. And that's where communication breakdowns, they're going to happen. They seem to sit at the center of so many co-parenting struggles, regardless of how the parents are getting along. When conflict shows up, how can caregivers tell the difference between a true disagreement and a power struggle that's really about unmet needs? You can get the answer to this question and more information from our HerPlus expert providers in this current roundtable discussion on co-parenting in our next episode.
That's a wrap. You carved out a few moments just for yourself, and that's a big deal.
We understand that time is limited, but we've got your back, which is why we keep these episodes short, sweet, and packed with goodness.
Don't miss a thing. Hit the follow button so you're always the first to know when a new episode drops. If you had as much fun as we did, let us know by leaving a review.
And remember to let other moms know that we're here doing motherhood alongside you, grateful to share a few moments taking care of you.